Every Macintosh amplifier ever built came from the same American factory, and the company has not skipped a single year of production since 1949. One design from the early 60s is still on the price list today, still wired by hand in that same workshop, while every rival brand of the golden age is either dead or reduced to a badge on someone else's gear. 75 years of amplifiers, from the first 50-watt monoblock to today's 2-kilowatt flagships, every model in one place. Understand this catalog and you understand why the blue meters became the last symbol of American high-end audio. You would expect the amplifier of 1949 to be the crude one. That is where the whole legend actually started. The story starts with two engineers and a problem that had beaten everyone else. Frank H. McIntosh, born in Omaha, Nebraska, in 1906, was not the classic image of a bench engineer. He wrote for Popular Mechanics, consulted for radio and television stations in Washington, D.C., and understood the business of sound as well as the physics of it. What he did not have yet was a design that could take the industry forward. That came in 1946, when he hired Gordon Gow. Gow was a former Royal Canadian Air Force officer with a rare combination on his resume: radar signals in wartime and audio transformer design in peacetime. Frank pointed him at the same wall every amplifier company in America was banging its head against. Push the output tubes hard, and the transformer at the end of the chain would smear the signal into harmonic distortion so obvious that anyone with ears could hear it. 50 watts of clean power was a fantasy in the mid-1940s. Every serious hi-fi review of the decade was, in effect, an apology for that fact. Gow's answer was a new kind of output transformer. The primary windings were wound together, side by side, so that the plate and the cathode of the output tubes worked in perfect symmetry. The trade name was the Unity Coupled Circuit. The patent, number 2,477,074, was granted on the 26th of July, 1949, the same year the company was incorporated as Macintosh Engineering Laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. That same year, the first product left the workshop, the 50W1. 50 watts of continuous power, from 20 Hz to 20,000 Hz, with less than 1% harmonic distortion across the entire audio band. Nothing else on the American market could touch it. The price was $249.50, which was serious money in a Truman-era living room. In 1951, the 50W2 arrived, with a refined transformer and a longer production run that would carry the design through 1955. That same year, the company left Maryland and moved to Binghamton, New York, into the building where every Macintosh amplifier that mattered would be assembled from then on. 50 watts was a milestone, but 20 years later, on a dairy farm in upstate New York, 50 watts would be laughed at. The dairy farm was Max Yasgur's in Bethel, New York, in August of 1969, and the sound engineer standing at the mixing tower was a 32-year-old from Massachusetts named Bill Hanley. 500,000 people were about to arrive, spread across a natural bowl of grass and mud, and Hanley had to make music reach the last row without a single professional PA rig existing in the world that was built for a crowd that size. What he did have was a stack of Macintosh monoblocks. The amplifier was called the MC3500. It had left Binghamton for the first time in 1968, 1 year earlier. A single-channel tube monoblock, delivering 350 watts of continuous power, which was more than any domestic amplifier in the world was making at the time. The price was $1,099, which put it firmly in the professional category and out of most living rooms. It was designed for one thing: to push large speaker systems in radio stations, in recording studios, in touring rigs, without cooking itself. The whole cabinet was oversized. The transformers were massive. The tubes glowed like small furnaces. Hanley chose it because no one else was building anything close. Accounts of Woodstock disagree on the exact count. Somewhere between 17 and more than 20 MC35, hundreds were bolted into Hanley's PA towers, driving two flanking speaker columns. And by the time Jimi Hendrix played his last chord on Monday morning, the Macintosh name had a story attached to it that no marketing department could have written. The amplifier that had been designed for radio stations had scored the largest audience in the history of amplified music up to that point. Every rock engineer in America now knew what a blue Macintosh chassis could do at 350 watts a channel. But the MC3500 was a tube design, and by the early 1970s, the industry was moving. Solid state was cheaper, cooler, and, on paper, more powerful per dollar. Macintosh had already crossed that line with the MC2500 in the studio market, and in 1971, the company released the machine that would define the professional stage forever, the MC2300. 300 watts per channel, stereo, solid state, $1,799. Bridge the two channels together and you had 600 watts of mono power out of a single chassis. It was, quietly, the most powerful commercial amplifier in America. For 3 years it sat in catalogs and studios without a headline moment. Then a chemist showed up. Owsley Stanley, universally known as Bear, was already a legend for reasons that had nothing to do with audio. But by 1973, he was fixated on a single problem. The Grateful Dead's sound on stage was arriving at the audience mangled, because the vocals were fed through the same PA that carried everything else, and the whole signal chain was a compromise. Bear's answer was to throw the entire concept of a public address system out and start again. Each instrument would get its own dedicated line of amplifiers and speakers, running clean from the stage to the crowd, with no mixer in between. Nothing existed that could do it. He was going to build it. He recruited Ron Wickersham, Dan Healy, and the crew at Alembic, including Mark Risine, Rick Turner, and John Curl. And for the amplifier that would sit at the base of every column, he chose the MC2300, not 48. Bridged, wired for mono, 600 watts apiece. The system was called the Wall of Sound, and it made its full debut on the 23rd of March 1974 at the Cow Palace in San Francisco. 28,800 watts of continuous, undistorted power, 600 feet of clear, articulate range in front of the stage, and something recognizable as music still holding together at a quarter of a mile. No PA had ever done that. No PA has ever done it since, because the Wall of Sound was economically impossible to keep on the road. And by October of that same year, the Dead had retired it. It had lasted 7 months. In those 7 months, it made the MC2300 one of the most photographed amplifiers in the history of American music. By 1974 then, Macintosh had 2 of its models playing the biggest stages in the world. And yet back in Binghamton, the company was doing something the rest of the American audio industry had already given up on. Marantz was gone from tubes. Fisher was gone. Scott was gone. But at the Macintosh factory, the tube line had never stopped, and the amplifier that was quietly outselling every solid-state product in the domestic catalog had been designed in 1961 and had not been touched since. The stage was where the reputation grew, but the money came from the living room. In the American 1950s, high fidelity was moving from hobbyist basements into upstairs sitting rooms, driven by long-play records, FM broadcasting, and a generation of veterans with disposable income and a taste for imported classical music on a good speaker. Macintosh had priced its first product for that market and had watched the demand build from there. The first machine that mattered in the domestic catalog was the MC30. It arrived in 1954, a single-channel tube monoblock delivering 30 clean watts for $153.50. That was roughly 1/3 of what a serious high-fidelity amplifier from a boutique brand cost at the time. And it was rated at a distortion figure the boutiques could not touch. The MC30 stayed in production until 1962, 8 full years, which in the electronics industry of the era was 3 product generations for anyone else. By 1955, the same chassis had grown into the MC60, 60 watts of continuous power, $219, and the same near-inaudible distortion. A pair of MC60s, wired for the 2 channels of the coming stereo era, was the setup that reviewers began quietly buying for themselves. It was the amplifier that put Macintosh into the audio press as a serious domestic brand, and not just a curiosity from Maryland. Then, in 1958, the RCA and Columbia stereo record standard arrived, and every high-fidelity manufacturer in America had 6 months to figure out what to do about it. Monoblocks in pairs were the workaround, but they were expensive, and they doubled the size of the setup on the shelf. What the market wanted was 1 chassis, 2 channels, 1 price. Macintosh answered with 2 products released more or less side by side. The MC240 came out in 1960. 2 channels of tube power, 40 watts per side, in 1 integrated chassis, for $288. It was designed for the serious domestic listener who wanted stereo without buying twice. The MC225 followed in 1961, a smaller, cheaper sibling delivering 25 watts per channel for $198, aimed at the buyer who wanted the Macintosh badge without stretching to a full-size setup. Both were successful. Neither was legendary. The legend arrived the same year as the MC225. It was designed by Gordon Gow, with Sidney A. Quarterman handling the deep engineering in the research department in Binghamton, and it was called the MC275. 75 watts per channel, in stereo, from a tube design, in one chassis, for $444. It was the most powerful stereo tube amplifier on the American market. It was also, by every distortion measurement of the era, the cleanest. Julian Hirsch reviewed it in Stereo Review, and did what Julian Hirsch almost never did, which was run out of technical objections. High Fidelity magazine put it in the same short paragraph as the very few amplifiers a serious buyer could recommend without asterisks. The MC275 became, by the mid-60s, the amplifier you bought if you had already made up your mind that you were not going to buy anything else. Its production run went from 1961 to 1970. In those 9 years, it became the flagship of the domestic tube era, the signature product of a factory that was, at that same moment, being told by the entire industry that tubes were finished. Because in 1967, the transistor arrived at Macintosh, and it did not arrive quietly. The transistor had been sitting on the workbench of every American audio engineer since Bell Labs demonstrated it in 1948. But for the first 15 years, it was too fragile, too noisy, and too limited in current to build a serious power amplifier. By the mid-60s, the semiconductor industry had solved almost all of those problems, and the calculation for a company like Macintosh was suddenly brutal. Transistors ran cooler. Transistors did not wear out. Transistors did not need the massive, hand-wound transformers that made a tube amplifier heavy and expensive. Every mid-price competitor in the American market, Marantz, Fisher, Scott, Harman Kardon, was already switching over. Whoever moved first with a solid-state design that met the Macintosh distortion standard was going to define the second act of American high fidelity. In 1967, Macintosh released two products on the same day. The MC2505 was the entry point. 50 watts per channel, solid-state, stereo, in a chassis roughly the size of a large book, for $549. And on the same shelf, at a different price point, sat the machine that would change what a Macintosh amplifier looked like for the rest of the company's history. The MC2105 delivered 105 watts per channel of solid-state power for $799. On the specification sheet, it was simply a more powerful stablemate to the MC2505. But on the front panel, on either side of the Macintosh badge, there were two glass windows lit from behind in a soft, cold blue, marked in a scale of watts. They were not the standard volume unit meters that every other manufacturer was using, and they were not a decoration. They were true output power meters, calibrated to display the actual root mean square wattage being delivered to the speakers, moment by moment, in real time. The blue meters were an internal design at Binghamton, and no single engineer in the public record ever claimed authorship of them. What is documented is the reasoning. Blue was chosen because at low room lighting levels, it produced almost no eye fatigue, which meant the meters could remain on for an entire evening of listening without becoming a distraction. The needles moved in wattage because Gordon Gow believed a customer paying for a Macintosh amplifier had a right to see exactly what the amplifier was doing, not what the input signal looked like on the way in. From that moment on, every serious Macintosh power amplifier would carry those two blue windows. They would become the single most recognizable design signature in the history of American audio. In 1969, the MC2100 arrived, delivering the same 105 watts per channel at a lower price of $599 to widen the market for the new solid-state platform without cannibalizing the flagship. And then, in 1971, came the machine that has already appeared in this story. The MC2300, 300 watts per channel of solid-state stereo power, $1,799. The model that Bear Stanley would order in quantities of 48, 3 years later for the Wall of Sound. The interesting fact about the Macintosh transition to solid-state is what did not happen. Marantz retired its tube line by 1968. Fisher was effectively done with tubes by 1969. Scott had exited by the early 70s. But in Binghamton, the tube production line never shut down. The MC275, still in the catalog, continued to sell in parallel with the new transistor products, because Gordon Gow refused to declare the tube dead. He believed the sound of a well-designed tube amplifier was audibly different from the sound of a well-designed solid-state amplifier, and that a serious high-fidelity manufacturer had a duty to build both. The competitors thought he was sentimental. In fact, he had just made the decision that would keep Macintosh alive when almost every one of those competitors was gone, because the 70s were about to arrive, and with them, the era of the amplifier as an object of extreme, almost architectural power. By the beginning of the 1980s, the American living room had stopped being the reference point for a high-end amplifier. The reference point was now the recording studio, the concert hall, and, increasingly, the custom home theater, built around a pair of the most demanding loudspeakers money could buy. Power ratings had inflated across the industry, and Macintosh answered with an amplifier that quietly reset the scale. The MC2500 appeared in 1980 and stayed in the catalog for a full decade. 500 watts per channel, solid-state, stereo, priced at $3,800, and built for professional studios that needed reliable, near-zero distortion power for extended sessions. It was the workhorse of the American mastering room throughout the 80s. The real jump came in 1992. The MC1000 was Macintosh's first monoblock to break the 4-digit wattage barrier, 1,000 watts of continuous power from a single chassis, at $6,500 each, meant to be bought in pairs and installed the way one installs furniture rather than electronics. It has never left the catalog since. The MC1000 is one of the longest-running high-power monoblocks in the history of audio, and it is still hand-assembled in Binghamton. Then, in the middle of the 2000s, Macintosh doubled the ceiling again with the MC2 kilowatt, a 2,000-watt monoblock that arrived in a two-chassis configuration, one for the electronics and one for the power supply, together weighing more than 300 pounds per side. It was, and remains, one of the most powerful commercial amplifiers ever offered to the private market. While the flagship monoblocks defined the top of the range, a parallel product line was quietly doing the volume. The MA integrated amplifiers combined preamplifier and power amplifier in a single chassis, aimed at the buyer who wanted a full Macintosh system without stacking 3 separate boxes on a shelf. The line began in 1972 with the MA6100, 70 watts per channel, and grew steadily through the MA6200, in 1978, the MA6400, and MA6800 in the mid-90s, and eventually the modern MA8900 and MA12000 of the current catalog, each one adding more inputs, more digital processing, and more power without ever losing the blue meters or the black glass front panel that had defined the brand for 4 decades. The 80s also brought a change of ownership that could have ended the company. In 1990, Macintosh Laboratory was sold to Clarion, the Japanese car audio manufacturer. It was a strategic bet by Clarion on the premium home audio brand, and for 22 years, it kept the factory open and the product line intact. In 2012, Macintosh was sold again, this time to Fine Sounds Group, an Italian holding company that also owns Sonus Faber and other high-end brands. Throughout both ownership changes, one thing did not move. The Binghamton factory kept building Macintosh amplifiers, by hand, on the same assembly floor where the 50W1 had been built in 1949. The 2 most recent flagships confirmed the trajectory. In 2024, for the 75th anniversary of the company, Macintosh released the MC 1.25 kilowatt, a 1,200-watt anniversary monoblock, priced at roughly $55,000. And in 2025 came the current top of the range, the MC 2.1 kilowatt, a 2,000-watt monoblock built across 3 separate chassis per side, priced at roughly $180,000. It is the most powerful, and the most expensive, amplifier Macintosh has ever built. The modern catalog also contains 2 machines that deserve to be named individually. The MC462, released in 2017, is the flagship stereo solid-state amplifier of the current lineup, a 300-watt per channel powerhouse that has become the reference product for high-end American dealers, demonstrating the brand to new buyers. And the MC901, released in 2022, is a hybrid dual mono design that puts a 300-watt tube amplifier and a 600-watt solid-state amplifier inside a single chassis, one section driving the high frequencies of the speaker, the other driving the low frequencies, on the theory that each technology plays to its strengths in the range where it belongs. All of this is impressive. None of it is the interesting part of the story, because the interesting part is that in every one of these catalogs, from 1993 to today, alongside the anniversary monoblocks and the hybrid flagships and the 2,000-watt architectural power amplifiers, Macintosh has continued to sell a single stereo tube amplifier whose circuit diagram has not been meaningfully changed since Gordon Gow drew it in 1961. The MC275 was discontinued in 1970, after 9 years in the domestic catalog, and for 23 years it existed only as a legend, traded between collectors on the vintage market, where working units sold for more than they had cost new. In 1993, 3 years after Gordon Gow's death, Macintosh brought it back. The reissue was called the Commemorative Edition, and it was engineered as a tribute. Same 75 watts per channel, same unity-coupled output stage, same chassis dimensions, same tube complement. The circuit that Gao had drawn in 1961 was put back into production, essentially untouched. That was 32 years ago. The Commemorative was followed by the Mark III, the Mark IV, the Mark V, the Mark VI, and in 2024, the Mark VIII. Each generation adjusting a component here, refining a transformer there, adding a front panel power switch, releasing a 50th anniversary edition in 2011 with a gold chassis. But the topology at the center of every one of those generations is still the 1961 design. The current MC275 in the price list sells for around $8,500 in the United States, and every one of those amplifiers is wired by hand in Binghamton, in the same building where the 50W1 was built 75 years ago. Macintosh will also still service the original 1961 units. The Binghamton factory keeps original transformers, chassis parts, and tube stock in inventory, and a working MC275 from the mid-60s can be sent back to the same building where it was originally assembled and be returned in specification. Marantz, Fisher, and Scott, the three American brands that walked away from tubes half a century ago, no longer exist as independent manufacturers. The brand names survive on foreign-owned budget electronics. Macintosh does not. The company that never stopped building tube amplifiers is the last American high-end audio brand from the 1940s, still in continuous production, in the same city, under a name that has not changed. The interesting question is not why Macintosh survived. The interesting question is why every other American electronics brand from the same era did not. Marantz was born the same decade, sounded almost as good, and outsold Macintosh in most of its first 15 years. It is now a name printed on a Japanese-owned budget receiver. The full story of that collapse, every model, every mistake, every decision that led the American high-end audio industry to hand its future to overseas manufacturers, is the next video on this channel, and it is on your screen right now.